Okay, so you may wonder, why am I talking about oysters in Colorado to you today? Well, the answer is I'm not just talking to you about oysters in Colorado. The story of oysters in Colorado is really the story of westward expansion. One of many examples of Americans moving west and carrying East Coast and European sensibilities with them that seemed out of place in the West. It's the story of the development of transportation networks. Here we see oysters being loaded off the wharves in Baltimore, loaded onto a wagon. This wagon would go to a train. This train would go to the end of the line, wherever its destination was. An oyster packed on ice could be saleable for a couple of weeks after it was pulled out of the water. So they got these oysters all over the West very quickly through the development of transportation networks. It's a story of how cities made use of their natural resources. This, again, is the oyster fleet in Baltimore. Baltimore was a very prosperous city, I'm sure you know, in the 19th century. And if you know Baltimore today, you know that this is also a story of the economic ascension and declension of cities and how that can be tied in part to natural resources. It's a story of technological advances in industrialization. Oysters were one of the first foods to be canned and canned for shipping. That's an early oyster can, courtesy of the Library of Congress. And industrialization, you can see the enormous shell pile here on the bottom right. And the flip side of that story, of course, it's a story of environmental consequences. The Chesapeake Bay hosts nowhere near the number of oysters that ecologists estimate it used to. Finally, it's a story of labor systems, and particularly heartbreakingly, it's a story of child labor. Many of the great oyster houses on the East Coast employed children. In these pictures on the left, you see a 7-year-old shucking, a 6-year-old shucking, an 11-year-old shucking. On the right, you see little Rosie Burdick shucking in South Carolina. She's 7 years old at the time. She shucked 3 buckets a day instead of going to school. These pictures are courtesy of a muckraking journalist who went out and took pictures of child laborers in the oyster houses. And you get a lot more stories, many more stories, when you start with oysters in Colorado. All stories that are usually addressed from an Eastern perspective. Stories that happen 2,000 miles away from where we are. And isn't it cool when we can connect that kind of a story to something that happened where we are today? It becomes much more relatable when you can serve it up on a half shell in Colorado rather than talking about it as something that happened over there in a place where your students may or may not have ever been.